Anytime I'm evaluating a new patient, the things that they seem to be the most worried about are ADHD and anxiety. And it seems like every patient I evaluate, whether it's in my office or even in the emergency room, seems to struggle with these two things. Which is a little bit interesting because if you look at it statistically, mood disorders, things like major depressive disorder or depression, are actually statistically way more likely than ADHD and anxiety. So what's going on here? Is it simply that ADHD and anxiety are actually more common and we have the statistics wrong? Or is there something else at play? So a good example of this is something called test anxiety, where I'll work with a lot of students who are undergrads. And what they'll sort of say to me is that, yeah, I get super anxious anytime I have to take a test. And as we kind of tunnel down into this, we can actually see that this is a common feature of ADHD, that a lot of kids who have ADHD will struggle to study, and so they struggle to focus, and something happens where something about their preparation makes it very, very hard to actually take a test. And this sort of test anxiety isn't just found in people who have ADHD. All of us have it a little bit, but it's also very common in people who have anxiety disorders. So if you have an anxiety disorder and you're prone to worry about the future, when you take a test, you may be especially afraid that you could fail and you could sort of fail out of college and kind of get kicked out, and all these kinds of doomsday scenarios pop up in your mind. And so as clinicians sort of noticed that there seems to be an overlap between ADHD and anxiety, they started to look into it from a research perspective. When they looked into it, what they found is actually staggering, that there's a 25 to 28% comorbidity between ADHD and anxiety. And what that means is that if you have ADHD, there's actually about a 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 chance that you also have an anxiety disorder. If you have an anxiety disorder, there's about a 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 chance that you also have ADHD. If we go back to looking at the comorbidity between ADHD and depression, you'll remember that there's actually a causative relationship, that having ADHD early on in life can actually lead to depression as a teenager or adult. And so people were kind of curious, is the same true of ADHD and anxiety? And it turns out that there doesn't appear to be an actual causative relationship, that something is going on in the brain that sort of causes people to have both of these things. As researchers looked into this, they made some very interesting discoveries. They essentially found that there may be a subtype of ADHD that includes anxiety. So remember, if we sort of even think about ADHD as a diagnosis, there's ADD, which is attention deficit disorder, and there's also ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So even within sort of the attentional disorders, we kind of know that there are some versions that don't have hyperactivity and some versions that do have hyperactivity. And this is also part of the reason why diagnosing ADD in adults can be tricky, because there usually isn't that hyperactivity component. As researchers looked into the relationship between ADHD and anxiety, what they discovered was maybe a third subtype, a subtype of ADHD that involves emotional dysregulation. So sometimes people with ADD really struggle with things like impulsivity and getting angry quickly, but it also appears that there's some specific connections in the brain between attention deficit disorder and the parts of our brain that experience fear and anxiety. And the link between ADHD and anxiety gets even more complicated once you start looking at treatment, because some of the first-line treatments for ADHD can actually exacerbate anxiety. So if you look at side effects for things like stimulant medication, one of the side effects of stimulant medication is actually worsening anxiety. One of the side effects of stimulant medication is actually increased restlessness or fidgeting. Another side effect of stimulant medication is actually insomnia or difficulty falling asleep. And all three of those things are actually diagnostic criteria for anxiety disorders. So as we've looked deeper and deeper into this relationship between ADHD and anxiety, we've uncovered some really interesting links. Researchers who have looked into the link between ADHD and anxiety have found that there are a couple of interesting overlaps. The first is that people with ADHD appear to be at times very fearless, which is kind of confusing because if I think of myself as having an anxiety disorder, I would think of myself as being more fearful as opposed to less fearful. But as we look into the brain, we'll sort of see how someone with ADHD and anxiety can actually behave in sort of a foolishly fearless manner. So in the brain of someone with ADHD, we have our reward circuitry, which is governed by the nucleus accumbens, and sort of also involves a certain degree of impulsivity. For a neurotypical brain, the way that we decide to engage in a behavior is we think about the reward, and then we also calculate the cost or what could go wrong. And both of these things integrate into one behavior. So essentially what we do is we look at the benefit and we think a little bit about what we should be scared of if we do that thing. And both of those things kind of combine, and then we decide to do it or not do it. A good example of this is like, let's say if you try to practice diving and you're jumping off of a diving board 30 feet in the air. If you're sort of looking down into the pool below or into the water below, there's a part of you that will be wanting to jump down because that's what you're here for and that's why you climbed 30 feet into the air. And at the same time, there's another part of your brain that as it looks down into the abyss below is going to be scared. So for a neurotypical brain, fear of an action and benefit of an action get integrated together. What we've sort of seen in the brains of people with ADHD is that these two things seem to be a little bit separate. And sometimes the reward of a behavior doesn't really get integrated into fear of a behavior. This also goes back to neuroscience. If we remember, people with ADHD's frontal lobes have a reduced inhibitory capacity. Remember that the frontal lobes are the brakes of the brain, which means that they sort of control the impulses or suppress other parts of our brain. And so in someone who has ADHD, their frontal lobes don't function quite as well, so their ability to essentially block impulses is lower. This becomes especially important for people who also have anxiety, because what we've discovered is that the frontal lobe's ability to suppress negative emotions is reduced in someone with ADHD. What does that mean practically? That means that if I have some kind of anxiety, normally what I would rely on, so if I didn't have ADHD and I had anxiety, what I'm relying on to control that anxiety is actually my frontal lobes. I'm relying on my frontal lobes to connect to and suppress the actions of my amygdala and limbic system. So when I feel anxiety, essentially I'm relying on my higher order brain functions to suppress it. So if we go back to our diving example, even though I look down into the water and I sort of feel this primal fear, don't jump, don't jump, don't jump, how do I actually end up jumping? Because I tell myself, oh, we climbed this because we want to learn how to dive. This is actually something that we're really excited about doing, and I love the experience of flying through the air and crashing into the water. These are things that I really enjoy. And that kind of argument that you have with yourself internally, and you've probably experienced that at some point in your life where there's something you want to do and your anxiety is telling you don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And what you have to do in that moment is conquer that anxiety. So what's going on in your brain as you conquer that anxiety? That's literally your frontal lobes suppressing the emotion from your amygdala and your limbic system. And now we see why people with ADHD frequently have anxiety. Remember, the comorbidity is somewhere between 25 and 28%. And that's because if you have an anxiety disorder, as those signals for anxiety kind of arise in your amygdala and limbic system, the ADHD brain has more difficulty suppressing that impulse. And so as researchers looked into this stuff, they sort of made all these different kinds of observations. On the one hand, people with ADHD sometimes behave fearlessly. And on the other hand, it seems like people with ADHD are more vulnerable to anxiety. How does that work? How can someone be both fearless and anxious at the same time? That's only confusing until you understand the neuroscience. Once you understand how these different circuits work in the brain, you can develop sort of a path forward. So if you're struggling with ADHD and anxiety, these are the different kinds of dimensions you need to think about. If you start to act still impulsively and fearlessly, and then you're kind of scratching your head because other times you're paralyzed by anxiety, the solution there is to slow down a little bit and think a little bit about the costs of behaviors. Almost recruit a little bit of that fear or anxiety to help you integrate into making the right choice. And on the flip side, if you find yourself being overly controlled by anxiety, chances are, if you've got ADHD, that's because your frontal lobes are not as good at suppressing your emotional circuitry. And so the good news is that there's actually treatment for people who both suffer from diagnoses of ADHD and an anxiety disorder. As we've just mentioned, as you tunnel down into the neuroscience, you can actually train certain faculties. So for example, meditation has been shown to strengthen the frontal lobes. And whether you have ADHD or an anxiety disorder, that sort of doesn't matter. What we know is for all human beings, meditation is going to strengthen your brain's ability to sort of suppress, calm down, and detach from negative emotion. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that research has shown that treating ADHD with stimulant medication can actually improve anxiety. And I remember earlier that I sort of said the opposite, that if you look at the side effects of stimulant medication, they can be pro-anxiety factors. Like the side effects of stimulant medication, remember, can include increased anxiety, increased restlessness, difficulty sleeping. But as people actually did clinical trials on this stuff, they discovered something very fascinating. When you take a stimulant medication, what it actually stimulates are your frontal lobes. It actually strengthens your brain's ability to suppress your negative emotion. So when you look at clinical trials of people who have ADHD and anxiety, what we find is that stimulant medication, rather than worsening anxiety, can actually improve our brain's ability to suppress it and control it. There are also interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, which sort of will entrain us to do things like slow down and not engage in impulsive behaviors. And so the good news is that even if you have ADHD and anxiety, this may seem like two separate things, that treating one will make the other one worse, or it may seem like things are kind of exponentially more difficult, but the science actually doesn't really support that. And the good news is that as long as you sort of recognize what you're dealing with, as long as you accurately kind of diagnose, okay, what is going on in my brain? Do I act impulsively and fearlessly at times? Are there times where I'm unable to suppress my anxiety? And once you sort of figure out what's going on, you can start developing a roadmap to take care of both of these problems.